When we sit down, it's time for the conversation, and joining me today in studio is Diana Hughes. She is the Senior Regional Communication Officer at UNHCR. She previously served as the Regional Editor for Africa Emergencies. She's worked for International News Network, ABC News, as digital journalist for Foreign Affairs. She's also been Associate Editor at the Ford Foundation. She holds a master's degree in broadcast concentration from Columbia University and also a certificate in parliamentary studies from London School of Economics. Dana, thank you for making time.
Thank you very much for having me here.
I would like you to paint a visual picture for the viewer. What is it like? What's the experience of refugees in the wake of coronavirus?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I think, the first thing I would say is that the experience is not necessarily monolithic. I can paint you three pictures, really. I can paint you the picture of a refugee in a camp that is often overcrowded. That is everything okay? Okay. I can paint you a picture of a refugee in a camp that where it's overcrowded, where there is a lack of access on a regular basis to proper sanitation, where healthcare facilities are either far away or are not necessarily readily available, where social distancing is going to be tough, where adhering to the same hand washing measurements is going to be tough. So that's a camp situation where people are a bit fearful. In an urban refugee environment, you have refugees who are primarily working in the informal sector, and this is across the world. They're primarily working in an informal sector. They're working at restaurants, they run markets, they're business owners. And so, of course, with various movement restriction measures, curfews, lockdowns around the world, those refugees, which actually make up 60 to 70% of the global refugee population, are hurting tremendously financially. At the same time, while you have governments that are putting in place ways to actually help ways to help national citizens who are struggling, not all of those plans include refugees. So you have that issue as well. And then I would say, and then the third situation that you have with refugees are those who are not necessarily in camps, but are also in settlements, and they're not in urban environments, but they don't live in camps, they live in rural areas where there's also, a question of access to healthcare, how close are healthcare facilities, the same thing, financial problems due to COVID, and then also dealing with restriction of movement. So,
and just staying with camps, we saw that the government announced that coronavirus has been confirmed in Kakuma. We also saw a Rohingya refugee die in a Bangladeshi camp. Why is this a deadly trend? We're seeing coronavirus in refugee camps. Why would you say it's a dangerous trend and it should be contained as soon as possible?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is that I don't know that I would call it a trend, to be honest. At this point, we feel incredibly lucky that there has not been a widespread outbreak of coronavirus in any of the camps. That we have done, that it has been largely contained in many of these places. Why is that the case? Well, it's partly because early on across the world, working with governments, and particularly in this region, measures were put in place to try to prevent it from spreading in the first place. So that included additional hand washing stations. That included additional training of healthcare workers in camps. It included working with governments to identify isolation centers immediately, places where you could have isolation centers as well as treatment centers. It meant working with epidemiologists to be able to quickly identify potential cases. And it meant working with refugees who really are the best advocates and the best ones to communicate how to prevent and the impact of this. So while we are unfortunately seeing cases in camps across the world, it has not been the widespread catastrophe that we were fearing. That doesn't mean that we're resting on our
Sorry, I
laurels.
would like to just interject and ask, why can't we afford to have coronavirus spreading in the camps? Why is it important to put in place containment measures?
Absolutely. And I think it goes to the answer to my first question. When you were looking at a camp where you have tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people who are living in close quarters, who where there is not, the option of traditional social distancing may not be an option, where there are issues with sanitation, where there are already issues with lack of health care. It was so important that early on we start with the containment measures. I think we understood and still understand that it's a race against the clock, and that whether it was no cases, whether it's one case, whether it's 10 cases, we have to treat it as if it could be a large scale outbreak. And that's really the only way to do that.
I'd like to find out from you, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced working with refugees, particularly during this COVID-19 period?
I think one of the challenges that while we stay and deliver, which is very much UNHCR's philosophy and what we're doing, that we don't do so at the risk of the health and safety of refugees or our staff. So, depending on what area you work in, if you were working in, delivering of aid, delivering of assistance, what does that mean? It means that we used to have in many camps twice a month food distribution. In several camps, we've changed it to once a month so that we don't have so many people gathering too often, right? We also have for that aid that are 1.5 meters. We deliver aid, and what we do is one of the things that we do is we tell the stories of refugees. We tell the stories of refugees who are surviving and in this challenging time. We tell the story of UNHCR and our partners and the government partners who are delivering aid, but we can't get there. So what does that mean? It means that in some cases, we're working with refugees, with refugee filmmakers to go and film their stories for us to distribute. We're working with staff members who are not communications people. It's a time where no matter what field you work in the humanitarian world, you're all pulling together.
And how does the challenges that you have experienced so far affect the well-being of refugees in camps? One could only imagine that if you can only do a delivery once instead of twice, how is that shifting the balance in those camps?
I think, we are working really closely with local partners, with refugees. And one thing that's very important to say, particularly in this region, is that we are very much advocating that refugees are part of whatever national contingency plan that exists for COVID for that nation, so that refugees are not left behind. And within that, it means that we have had to find more creative ways to make sure that aid and assistance gets to the people that is needed. But it's something that we're doing because we have to.
New challenges is COVID-19 posing to refugees? We already know their life as a refugee is challenging as is. What new challenges has COVID-19 brought their way?
I think one of the biggest challenges, particularly for refugees that are urban refugees and refugees that live out of camp, is the economic challenge. Is facing challenges of, to be honest, a lot of people that are impoverished and that are living in settlements. But as I said earlier, refugees remain even that much more vulnerable, because in many cases, when governments are looking to provide additional aid and support and cash assistance, refugees aren't national citizens. Now, that doesn't mean that governments are completely letting them go. It means that we have to work very closely with national governments to find a way to ensure that these refugees who are already living on the brink, in a way, don't lose whatever livelihood opportunities that they already had. We're seeing an issue like the rest of the world, I think, with gender-based violence, with sexual and gender-based violence, making sure that women and children that are at risk, and that are seeing an uptake in this, have access to counseling, have access to support. Um, we're upping our hotlines around the world. I know that's for sure true in Kenya, and increasing the way that we communicate in various languages, whether that be Somali or Anur or Amharic or Arabic, Swahili. These are armed at least with information, and so that even though it's harder for us to get to them to help them meet these challenges, we are doing everything that we can to do that. And at the same time, we're talking about some of the most underfunded crises in the world. You're talking about in DRC, where there is still a lot of active conflict in the Northeast. And so you're fighting active conflict in the Northeast, you're seeing a resurgence of Ebola, and then at the same time, you're dealing with COVID. And all of this means it needs more support, it needs more staffing that can help, and it needs more money and funding. And I have to say that the international community has done a great job in really helping us to meet the funding needs in regards to COVID preparedness and impact. I think that there's an understanding that if all of us aren't, I think there's an understanding that if all of us aren't protected from coronavirus, none of us are protected. That's how this virus is moving. But the issue then becomes, it can't be at the expense of other life-saving support, funding needed for other life-saving support that we're still doing.
Speaking of funding, we're seeing funding being cut back every single day. And we also saw in terms of aid, the WFP said it was going to cut food aid by about 30%. And those in refugee camps in Uganda are beginning to feel the pinch of that. Does this leave refugees at the risk of starvation?
I think that, yes, obviously, the problem right now is it's an unfortunate confluence of issues. It's food insecurity. And, in Uganda, refugees have freedom of movement. Refugees are able to do some of their own farming. They're able to have land to farm off of, and I would say in Kenya, even though it's an encampment policy, there's so much commerce happening in Kakuma and in Dadaab, and people, they aren't able to be 100% self-sufficient, but they've been able to weather the storm of food ration cuts, which sadly, as we've had more and more people who are displaced every year, 70 million people are displaced, the highest number ever, and that trend seems to go up. Food ration cuts is something that I think refugees have become not accustomed to, but it's unsurprising. The difference that we have right now is that the other coping mechanisms, the other livelihood activities, the farming, the selling of the farming, the running of small businesses in camps and outside of them, the selling of produce, things like that, that has been severely curtailed because of COVID restrictions. So it is is a very unfortunate confluence of things that are happening. And I think both UNHCR and WFP are trying to ring an alarm bell and sound, and that without a step up of more traditional food aid and more funding for that, you do have populations that are now going to be extremely at risk.
Dana, I would also like to find out, Kenya, most recently, we said there will be a cessation of movement of people at the Kenya-Tanzania border and the Kenya-Somali border. And in the wake of COVID-19, many countries have taken this stand. They're closing off their borders. How does this particularly put refugees at risk?
Well, I think that we very much, as UNHCR, are calling for countries to still, even in these challenging times, even understanding that border closures are happening all over the world. Refugees, people fleeing war and persecution, still, according to the 1951 Geneva Convention, have the right to seek asylum. And while we do understand that every country has the right to make decisions as to the best ways to protect their population and their borders, we are calling on nations in Africa and across the world to remember, to please remember that the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, and that nobody chooses to be a refugee. To choose to flee in the midst of a pandemic means that, obviously you're really fleeing war and persecution and conflict, and that your situation that you feel like is quite desperate. And so these nations, particularly in this continent and in this region, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, they are and have been some of the most generous nations towards refugees in the world. They've been a leader in welcoming and hosting and in working now to include refugees in national systems. So, we're here, countries here and countries around the world, to plead, that you can protect your populations against COVID while also not making sure that you adhere to international law.
Last but not least, before we wind up, I'd like to find out from a very humane perspective, because one might be wondering, we ordinary people outside of camps are really struggling to cope during these COVID-19 times. How are refugees doing? How are they coping and surviving in those camps? If you could just paint a picture.
Sure. I think that refugees, like the rest of us, are scared. I think that they are, concerned. They, more than anyone, understand the risk of what could happen if this spreads across the camps. They have had to deal before with outbreaks of other kinds of disease, of cholera, of thinking about malaria. I mean, they're at risk for many different things. That said, I think it's important to remember that refugees are some of the most resilient people you will ever meet. These are people that have faced, for people that have not been refugees before, that have faced unimaginable uncertainty, often unimaginable violence. And so I think that in some ways, the rest of the world can learn a bit from refugees on resilience, on how to cope, on the tenacity and the determination of the human spirit. That doesn't mean that we take it for granted. We're definitely stepping up with our partners, mental health and counseling, access to mental health and counseling. I mean, that's important. But I think from a personal perspective, and seeing and talking to refugees in this situation, they very much are aware. They're concerned, but they also are people that are ready to still persevere, and to be that are people that are still ready to persevere, and they're drawing on that resilient spirit.
Are they able to get access to, let's say, masks? Because I was during just doing background for the show, I was watching that Syrian kids, sometimes even protective gear is not enough for them. What would you say the situation looks like, particularly in Kenyan camps? Do they have adequate hand washing places where they can wash their hands, protective gear? How does it look like in camps?
So it's very interesting that you asked that, and I'm glad that you did. I think that across the world, and particularly across the continent, in Niger, in Malawi, in Kenya, you have refugee and refugee tailors who've been coming together to manufacture cloth masks for their population. In Kakuma, you have an amazing refugee entrepreneur who was making soap, lowered his prices, and is now making hand sanitizer. So it's a situation where, yes, I mean, I think protective gear is an issue around the world, and having enough. But it's also a situation where refugees, just like Africans, I might add, across the continent, are finding homegrown solutions to take care of their own communities. It's really a situation where, at UNHCR, we have our theme for World Refugee Day, which will be June 20th, is that inclusion and everyone counts. And one of the reasons why that's our theme, particularly for this period of coronavirus, is because it has really shown that the health of every single one of us, the health and well-being of every single one of us, is dependent on one another. And to that, we're working with partners, with the WHO, with national governments, with our own UN sister agencies, to make sure that there is enough hand washing facilities, that there are protective gear. But refugees are really stepping up and taking a lot of responsibility for their own communities.
30 seconds, very briefly, where do we go from here in ensuring that we keep our refugees safe as much as we're keeping ourselves safe? Very briefly.
Great. I think that we continue on the same path, which is to ensure that we have preventive measures, and that we also now have measures in place healthcare-wise for when, as it's been pointed out, there are cases that come up. I think we also need to move to look to how do we help the economic impact on this? What is the long-term economic impact for refugees, and how do we ensure that gains and progress that were made for refugees being self-reliant and being able to be included in society and also to provide for themselves and their families are not backtracked because of this crisis?
Dana, thank you so much. That's where we leave it. Thank you for sharing some of the insights.
Thank you very much. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you. After the break, we come back with Social Watch.